Good evening, curious traveler. Tonight, you'll meet two hobbits who, without even realizing it, uncover secrets no sage would dare to set down on parchment, Merry and Pippin. This evening, they are not chasing after distant adventures, but discovering something far more precious, the small arts that turn idleness into wisdom. And believe me, these are lessons every weary heart should hear before closing its eyes. For who better than hobbits, masters of the post-lunch nap and champions of well-timed pauses, to teach us that true courage sometimes lies in doing nothing at all? As this story unfolds, you will see how Merry's lightheartedness, mixed with Pippin's unbridled imagination, creates fertile ground for unexpected laughter and reflections so simple they turn into something profound. Between chuckles and mishaps, they reveal hidden secrets in the simple act of resting, how to ignore obligations without guilt, how to find an unexpected ally in silence, how to turn a nap into a strategic companion. A true manual of rest, signed by hobbits themselves. This is not just another adventure from the Shire, it is one of the most curious, because it brings to light what is so rarely spoken, that rest can also be a triumph. And if you wish to smile before sleep, and awaken with the sense of having learned something precious, this is the perfect tale. And if you feel these hobbit lessons deserve to be shared, consider supporting our little fellowship, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this journey with those who also need to rediscover the lightness of sleep. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine dusk settling over the Shire, among the whisper of leaves and the lazy hush of the afternoon, where the air carries the sense of rich earth and homely hearths. Feel the weight of the day giving way, as though the whole world were breathing more slowly. It is within this gentle rhythm that the story opens softly before you. Chapter 1: Beneath the oak's shadow, an unlikely guide is born. The sun was slowly sinking over the hills of the Shire, casting a golden glow across ripe fields of barley and wheat. The air was laced with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and the idle smoke from homely hearths, where kettles still simmered with late tea. The world seemed suspended between work and rest, but for Merry and Pippin, the balance had long since tipped in favor of leisure. They had just indulged in a generous lunch, the sort that included more dishes than a calendar could ever count: steaming meat pies, honey-roasted vegetables, thick slices of bread drowned in butter, and, because Pippin insisted, 2 extra helpings of cream cakes. When at last the banquet ended, both tumbled into deep sleep beneath an ancient oak, crumbs still clinging to their waistcoats. It was in this drowsy state that the grand idea, or at least grand to hobbit hearts, arose. Pippin, stretching noisily and releasing a yawn that startled a nearby blackbird, cracked open his half-closed eyes and murmured, "Merry, I think I've just had a revelation." Merry, who at that very moment was dreaming of cider barrels rolling straight to his door, opened one suspicious eye. "A revelation? I hope it's not another of your recipes for gooseberry stew, Pippin." No, nothing of the sort," Pippin replied, sitting up with difficulty as though gravity itself had tripled. "It's far greater than that. I believe that true hobbit wisdom, the oldest and most secret of our traditions, lies not in banquets nor in dances, but in the sublime art of doing absolutely nothing." Merry raised an eyebrow, smoothed his tousled hair, and for a moment held his silence. Then, with the solemn tone of one quoting an ancient proverb, he replied, "The real adventure, my dear Pippin, is not found in going to distant places, but in discovering the perfect place to go nowhere at all." They looked at each other, and a mischievous spark flickered in their eyes. Destiny, at least according to their imaginations, had spoken. "We must record this, Merry," cried Pippin, fumbling through his pockets in search of something that might serve as parchment. He found only a crumpled piece of wrapping paper, blotched with jam. We'll write a guide, a proper Hobbit manual. The guide to the art of doing nothing. Merry sighed, but a slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. So be it. The world out there writes about wars, heroic deeds, and endless conquests. We shall write about rest, which is, perhaps, the noblest of all victories. And so the mission began. With a solemnity fit for kings, they sat side by side under the oak's shade, improvising chapters for their monumental work. Pippin, his voice swollen with enthusiasm, dictated titles such as The Ideal Post-Lunch Napping Posture, How to Ignore Urgent Tasks with Grace, and The Secret of the Contagious Yawn. Merry, trying to impose some order, scribbled in hurried script upon whatever scraps came to hand, the margins of old maps, empty envelopes, even the back of a cake recipe. With each new chapter they laughed, as though unveiling some forbidden secret. Yet they soon realized that writing alone was not enough, field research was required. A theory without practice is no more than pipe smoke, Merry declared, tapping the quill against the page. We must demonstrate each posture, each technique of idleness. Pippin agreed so quickly he nearly tripped over his own words. He discovered an old hammock strung between two willows and announced he would test the ideal posture there. He climbed in with difficulty, wriggled once, twice, thrice, until the hammock gave way beneath his enthusiasm. With a loud thud, the orchard rang with laughter that sent crows flapping into the sky. Write this down. First conclusion of research: hammocks are unreliable when seeking absolute stillness, said Pippin, still lying in the grass, chuckling at himself. Meanwhile Merry, attempting to solemnly recite an introduction for the guide, let slip a yawn so long that his words melted into a mumble. He finished by dozing off with the quill still in hand, scrawling crooked lines across the paper. Pippin watched, shook his head, and remarked, "Excellent, Merry. You've just demonstrated the unexpected collapse during inspiration. That deserves its own chapter." And so, through falls, naps, and ink-stained scribbles, the Hobbit's Guide to the Art of Doing Nothing began to take shape. Not as a neat tome of wisdom, but as a living document, stuffed with hurried notes, crossed-out comments, and crooked sketches of ideal armchairs. Even the margins filled with observations: note, never write after a third slice of cake, or test willow shade at 3 in the afternoon, excellent for short dreams. And thus, between drafts and laughter, the most unlikely mission in the Shire was born, a guide not about battles, but about the silent victory of rest. Chapter 2: The Doubtful Science of Idleness with Dignity. The next morning dawned as clear as a freshly washed handkerchief, and the light, touching the hills, seemed to ask for silence so as not to wake the tardy foxes. Gravity, Pippin, is a treacherous force when one seeks the ideal posture for idleness. It conspires to keep us in motion when all we desire is perfect stillness. With this solemn reflection, Merry inaugurated the second chapter of the guide. Pippin, his eyes half closed, nodded as if he had just heard a great philosophical revelation, though at the same time he was trying to balance a plate of biscuits upon his belly. Merry straightened up, the quill tucked behind his ear and a map spread across the checkered cloth. Pippin yawned like a far-off church bell. "Today, Pippin," announced Merry, adjusting the map as though it were the chart of a grand campaign, "we shall research the ideal post-lunch napping posture and, at the same time, investigate the art of ignoring urgent tasks with grace. 2 fronts of the same army." "Splendid," replied Pippin, ruffling his golden hair with his fingers. "Then the first urgent task to be ignored, my dear commander, is Bolger's invitation to a modest second breakfast." "Modest, mind you," he said, "modest." Merry cleared his throat with a firmness that sought to conceal the sudden interest awakened. "Ignoring gastronomic invitations is the highest proof of discipline, Hobbit discipline, of course." I shall note it in the guide." They set out through the village like scholars in search of an ancient wisdom, guided by a map Merry had drawn with arrows and curious symbols, armchairs, clouds, willow leaves, and tiny setting suns with sleepy faces. The first target was the mystery of the most comfortable spot. They tested, one by one, the thrones of rest across the Shire. They began with the straw chair on the miller's porch. Pippin lay down at an angle, his neck resting in his fingers. "The chair creaks like an old oak," he said, closing one eye. "That is music," Merry replied. "The sound of home, of ovens, and of lazy afternoons." Then they stretched upon the grass, in the shade of a willow that seemed to know the language of waters. The cool green pressed against their backs, and the scent of sweet earth rose like memory. Merry noted, grass slices thoughts into thin slivers, perfect for falling asleep without realizing. They passed a sun-warmed stone bench, a haystack covered with cloth, and a rug before the inn's fireplace. By the end of the morning, Pippin summarized, with the conviction of one who had discovered ultimate truth. "They are all perfect. Some are simply more perfect than others." Merry twisted his mouth, striving to keep the science in its place. "We shall write, comfort is more geography than geometry. And that sounds important enough." When the sun had climbed high, they began the positions. Merry laid down rules as one might govern the winds, the angle of knees, the placement of feet, the height of cushions, the distance of the teacup, for tea must never be reached with effort, otherwise it is not tea, it is work. Pippin, obedient yet dramatic, offered demonstrations. "Posture of the contented goose," he declared, arms crossed over his belly and head tilted in saintly rest. It lasted 12 seconds. "Far too theatrical," said Merry. "Lacks naturalness." "Posture of the moon over the table," Pippin continued, bending into a curious arch across 2 cushions. "Pippin, that is a recipe for cramp." They tested the posture of the sleepy brook, arm over eyes, long breathing, the posture of the apple basket, knees drawn, chin to chest, silly grin, and the posture of the wheat field, arms open, as if to welcome the wind. Each attempt came with the most serious descriptions of comfort, temperature, sense, and inevitable defeat. On one such attempt, Pippin decided to perfect the Zen atop a pile of pillows. He climbed with wobbly balance, closed his eyes, inhaled, and as he exhaled a victorious sigh, the tower collapsed. One cushion flew to the window, another struck a clay pot, the third landed squarely upon Merry's head, crowning him king of a downy Shire. "Write this down," said Pippin, still wide-eyed, "gravity is the enemy of theatre." "No, gravity is a master of etiquette," Merry corrected, brushing off the dust. "It teaches one to remain simple." By afternoon, they faced the second challenge, how to ignore urgent tasks with grace. The village buzzed with small summons, an aunt calling for help peeling potatoes, a neighbor asking for an opinion on his fence, the postman announcing, "Letter from Uncle Ario." Pippin, tempted by each novelty like a bee before flowers, whispered to Merry, "What if we ignore, but politely?" Saying "I'll be right there" in such a sweet tone, it sounds as if we've already gone. "That is the heart of the chapter," Merry replied, lifting his quill as though it were a sword. "It is not refusal, it is gentle deferral. It is art, not offense." They then elaborated the principles of grace. 1. The disarming smile, the face becomes summer, none demand autumn. 2. The flexible promise, in a while may, in the language of rest, mean when the clouds decide. 3. The poetic excuse, mention the wind, the light, the song of a thrush. Poets always seem busy, even when idle. In the midst of this exercise, however, arose the greatest trial. A chatty cousin appeared, determined to recount in detail the tale of the bread that seemed cake, but was bread. Merry and Pippin joined forces. They applied the vacant stare, a technique they resolved to formalize on the spot. "New chapter," whispered Merry, excited, "the technique of the vacant stare to avoid work." "And to avoid cousins," added Pippin, widening his eyes at a horizon that did not exist. The method required 3 steps. A. Soften the gaze, as though watching a boat that may or may not be upon the lake. B. Breathe lightly, so that other people's words drift by like clouds. C. Nod sparingly, HMHM, in the rhythm of leaves. It worked for nearly half a minute. Then Pippin, too generous in his nodding, lost the rhythm and let out a HMHM, so firm the cousin took it as approval for a second chapter of the bread saga. Merry noted, resigned, the vacant stare does not replace strategic retreat. To complete their research, they resolved to consult an older, wiser hobbit, wise in the craft of doing the least with dignity. They found him beneath the shade of a walnut tree, sharp as a proverb and slow as an hourglass. They called him simply Old Bramble, for none dared cut the living hedge that guarded his garden. "Master Bramble, we have come seeking counsel," said Merry, with respect. "We search for the best posture for napping and the art of ignoring what presses upon us." The old hobbit scratched his chin, observed 2 ants conversing at the tree's root, and then offered a teaching so ambiguous it seemed definitive. "To sleep, lads, lie where your heart has already lain. To ignore, look towards something that has no need of you, the sky will do." "And if the sky is cloudy?" asked Pippin, practical for a moment. "Better still. Clouds are excuses walking." They took note of the counsel as one might collect an old folk song. But on that very bench they soon tasted turbulence of spirit. For a smell of bread drifted into the garden like an invisible rope. Pippin lifted his nose, eyes gleaming. "It almost feels like a summons. A polite summons." "Discipline," Merry reminded him, laying a hand upon his shoulder. "To ignore with grace." "We eat only to thank for the invitation," Pippin suggested, already half rising. "It is good manners." They yielded, of course. But they turned the slip into science. The line between grace and gluttony is short. To cross it requires invisible cutlery. They laughed, chewing slowly, as though learning time by taste. On their way back, they found the inn lively. Tankards clinked, someone tested a lute that insisted on being out of tune. Merry, eager to conclude the experiment, attempted to demonstrate the posture of the wheat field in a high-backed chair before the fire. Pippin, inspired by the music, rehearsed a choreographed yawn and raised his arms in triumph. At that exact moment, Merry's chair slid back 2 inches, a neighbor's mug, teetering on the table's edge, chose adventure, and the lute at last produced a perfect chord by striking the floor. All eyes turned. Pippin froze, arms still aloft, mouth half open in an interrupted yawn. Merry rose with the dignity of a king who had toppled his own throne and declared, unblushing. "Important observation for the guide, the environment must cooperate. Rest, when provoked, sometimes takes revenge." At day's end, they lay again beneath the willow. The notebook, now a little chaos of arrows, crumbs, and scattered phrases, carried the fragrance of minimal effort. Merry turned the pages, content with what he called progress. "We have the journey of the most comfortable spot and the primer on the art of ignoring. We have discovered that all places are perfect and that flexible promises do not burn bridges. And we have devised the chapter on the vacant stare, with warnings, naturally." Pippin smiled, his green eyes slowly losing focus. "And we have learned that rest is mischievous. The more we chase it, the more it plays at hiding. The trick is to pretend we do not care, and then, poof, it appears." The willow whispered something that seemed to agree. And as the evening laid gold upon the edge of its leaves, the 2 friends drifted gently to sleep. Chapter 3: Curious Experiments on Foolish Yawns. A yawn, my dear, is not a sign of weakness, but a universal invitation to surrender. It is the melody of the weary soul seeking the harmony of rest, said Merry, with the solemnity of one unveiling an ancient mystery. Pippin, who at that moment was nibbling the edge of a slice of cake, raised his eyebrows as if he had just heard the key to decipher the secrets of the world. He swallowed quickly, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and replied, "And what if we could control the yawn, Merry? Just imagine turning a simple opening of the mouth into an irresistible force, capable of toppling entire armies of hard work and lining everyone up towards their pillows." Merry laughed, but soon straightened his posture, adjusted the quill in his notebook, and declared, "Then let that be our next chapter, the secret of the contagious yawn." And thus the experiments began. The first experiment, the forced yawn. Gathered beneath the willow's shade, they decided to begin with the most obvious technique, the intentional yawn. Merry, concentrating, opened his mouth slowly, as though shaping silence into the form of an arc. He prolonged the gesture until his eyes watered, trying to provoke in Pippin the inevitable response. Pippin watched intently, but instead of yawning, burst into laughter. "You look more like a goldfish gasping out of water." Merry, blushing, firmly noted, forced yawns may provoke laughter instead of sleep. Result: inconclusive. Determined to continue, they switched roles. Pippin, with dramatic talent, leaned back, lifted his hand to his mouth, and released such a resounding yawn that he startled 2 sparrows from the tree. He then rubbed his eyes deliberately, as though surrendering to absolute fatigue. Merry tried to resist, but felt his jaw tremble. Slowly, the yawn overtook him, like an inevitable tide. "See?" said Pippin, triumphant. "It's like magic. I command the winds of sleep." "You command theater more than sleep," Merry replied, but was already noting, theatrical yawn has a high contagion rate, especially among the unsuspecting. The second experiment, the spontaneous yawn. After several ridiculous tests, they concluded that the true power lay in the natural yawn. They decided, then, to wait for the right moment. Pippin lay down on the grass and gazed at the sky, convinced that merely watching clouds would summon a genuine yawn. Merry, meanwhile, attempted to read an old apple pie recipe in a monotonous voice, hoping to induce tiredness upon himself. Minutes passed in silence, until Merry, distracted by the absurd quantities of butter in the recipe, yawned without realizing. Pippin, at once, was swept along, yawning in response. Laughter followed, for neither could stop. It was like an epidemic of cheerful laziness, a cascade of surrender to rest. "This is science, Merry," Pippin exclaimed, eyes still damp. "We've discovered the invisible current that binds drowsy souls." "Science, yes, but untamable," Merry replied, rubbing his eyes. "The yawn bows to no orders, it is master of itself. Imaginary charts and outlandish theories. Like all good Hobbit researchers, or at least like 2 hobbits who believed themselves to be researchers, they decided to turn their discoveries into organized theory." Pippin scratched a crooked circle on the ground, declaring it to be the circle of contagion. He drew arrows linking one hobbit to another, as though yawns were invisible arrows shooting across the village. "Look, Merry, if one hobbit yawns, 3 neighbors yawn in response. Those 3 then infect 9 others, and soon the whole tavern is open-mouthed, surrendered to the irresistible power of nothingness." Merry, feigning great seriousness, added formulas with random numbers, 3y equals 1n, 3 yawns equal 1 nap. Then he wrote, yawn plus silence equals maximum contagion. The guide, already full of scribbles, gained a new section of absurd diagrams. There were line graphs rising and falling with the intensity of yawns, tables comparing discrete yawn versus dramatic yawn, and even an illustration of Pippin with his mouth wide open, captioned, "Example of theatrical yawn style." Field research. To validate their theory, they resolved to conduct field research in the village. They slipped quietly into the inn, where some hobbits were chatting around their mugs of ale. Merry, with the air of one performing a secret ritual, feigned a wide and sonorous yawn. At first, no one seemed to notice. But then one of the older hobbits, sitting near the fire, let out a genuine yawn, dragging along the neighbor beside him. Within moments, a wave of yawns rippled through the room like a ragged choir. Pippin, delighted, nudged Merry. "It worked. We are masters of contagion." But the celebration was brief. One poorly timed yawn from Pippin turned into a hiccup, and the hiccup became a sneeze. The noise shattered the magic, and everyone burst into laughter, pointing at the young hobbit with the red nose. "Important note," Merry said, trying to maintain composure. "False yawns may degenerate into undesirable noises. Risk of public ridicule." The disaster at Bolger's council. Encouraged by their partial success, they decided to take the experiment to a bolder level, applying the technique at a family meeting. Cousin Bolger had gathered relatives to discuss practical matters, such as fences and crops, providing fertile ground to test the theory. At the height of the conversation, Merry leaned back and let out a discreet, almost elegant yawn. The effect was immediate. 2 cousins yawned in response, and soon half the room was opening their mouths lazily. Pippin, excited, decided to intensify. He produced a theatrical yawn, accompanied by a stretch and a long sound like wind echoing through caverns. The result was catastrophic. Not only did it trigger yawns in cascade, but it also roused Aunt Lobelia, who until then had been dozing quietly. Confused and irritated, she believed they were mocking her and expelled them from the room amid a storm of grumbles. New conclusion: contagious yawning must be used with caution at family gatherings. Merry noted, embarrassed. Conclusions on the experiment. Back beneath the willow, they threw themselves onto the grass, exhausted from so much laughter. The guide now had a new chapter, filled with serious notes and comical scribbles, proving that even the most trivial gesture could turn into science when seen through hobbit eyes. "So, Merry," said Pippin, gazing at the clouds, "if a yawn can spread like wildfire, isn't that proof that rest is, deep down, the most powerful force in Middle-earth?" Merry smiled, closing his eyes. "Perhaps it is, Pippin. For while others write tales of wars and kingdoms, we write the silent story of yawns and dreams." And so, lulled by the invisible music of fatigue, they surrendered, as though the afternoon itself were the world letting out a great sigh. The willow whispered above them, and even the wind seemed to open its mouth in a lazy yawn, inviting all to share in that universal surrender to rest. Chapter 4: The Strategic Nap, Between Doing and Nothing, Hobbit Wisdom. It isn't laziness if you're recharging. It's strategy. A well-placed nap can be more revolutionary than 1,000 completed tasks, said Pippin, with the solemnity of a general who had just revealed his most powerful tactic. Merry lifted his eyes from the notebook, measuring his friend with an expression that wavered between skepticism and curiosity. "Strategy, you say? Then we are not only scholars of rest, but also strategists of sleep." "Exactly," Pippin replied, clapping his hands and immediately yawning afterwards, which diminished the grandeur of his claim. "Think about it, everyone runs back and forth, like ants carrying crumbs far bigger than they can carry. But we, by lying down at the right moment, find the secret path. Sleeping isn't stopping, it's advancing while lying down." Merry laughed, but the phrase stayed with him. It was true that, in recent days, the 2 hobbits had repeatedly heard from relatives and neighbors remarks such as, Don't you have anything better to do, or while you rest, others are working? The pressure to always be doing something seemed to creep even into the Shire, where life was meant to run peacefully. There is a sickness that haunts the minds of folk, said Merry, taking on the reflective tone he so enjoyed. The sickness of believing that every minute must be spent on some visible task. Toxic productivity? Pippin interrupted, proud of having invented an expression that sounded grand. A terrible ill. Does more harm than a bucket of spoiled milk left out in the sun. Amused, Merry wrote in the guide, toxic productivity, dangerous habit of trying to do everything, and in so doing, resting not at all. To prove they were not simply surrendering to idleness, they decided to call their naps advanced research. Thus, whenever they were caught dozing in the sun, beneath trees, or before the hearth, they would answer with full seriousness. We are working on the most complex chapter of the guide, Merry would say, adjusting the quill behind his ear. Practical field analysis, Pippin would add, before closing his eyes again. The curious thing was that in those moments, new ideas always seemed to appear. One afternoon, after napping beneath an orchard, they awoke convinced that the horizontal position helped the mind to think better. When we lie down, ideas flow down from the head to the heart, Pippin philosophized, still drowsy. That is why dreams are so wise. Merry did not disagree. He wrote in the guide, naps may be a source of inspiration, recommended to nap with notebook within reach. One morning, a neighbor asked their help to mend the fence separating the chicken garden from the cornfield. Merry and Pippin, in the name of the science of idleness, agreed, but promised to do it in the Hobbit way, with generous breaks. They sat before the posts, discussing at length the best way to nail the planks. The conversation drifted to old songs, then to tales of travels, and at last both were lying on the grass, gazing at the sky. They dozed off without noticing. When they awoke, the neighbor had already finished the repair by himself. To their surprise, however, the man thanked them. Strange to say, but while watching you rest, I thought perhaps I was rushing too much. I did the work calmly, and it turned out better than if I'd hurried. Merry and Pippin smiled, like two masters who had given a lesson without moving at all. See, Merry, said Pippin, puffing his chest. Our nap was productive for him. We're revolutionaries lying down. Inspired by the episode, they composed a little song, the song of resistance, half ditty and half hymn, which echoed through the Shire. Do not rush, do not run, for the world does not flee. Sleep, for haste is the one who hides. The urgent task waits by the gate. Who closes eyes early awakens with sense. They sang it always before lying down, as if reciting a protective spell against the tyranny of hurry. But the greatest revelation came on a rainy day, when they were at the inn, pretending to write the guide amid the hearth's warmth. Merry scribbled strange formulas, while Pippin yawned at regular intervals, as though testing a secret rhythm. Suddenly, the entire inn was overtaken by a drowsy silence. Some hobbits closed their eyes, others began dozing at the tables. The innkeeper, noticing, decided to lower the fire to make the atmosphere even cozier. When they awoke, Merry noticed something curious. Everyone seemed refreshed, even in better spirits. Little troubles that had once agitated conversation had vanished, as though the pause had dissolved the tensions. Pippin, we have just witnessed a hobbit miracle, said Merry, astonished. The nap not only aids us, but improves the whole environment around. Of course, Pippin exclaimed. We have discovered the strategic nap, recharging energy for nothing more. The title was immediately entered into the guide, in large letters, with a clumsy drawing of two hobbits lying down, surrounded by arrows pointing to words like peace, joy, and more cake. That night, While the wind howled softly outside, Merry and Pippin spoke at length about the difference between laziness and strategy. "Laziness is not caring," said Merry, staring at the ceiling of the smile. "But strategy is self-care. It is choosing rest as a weapon against haste." "Exactly," Pippin agreed, already half asleep. "It's like wielding an invisible sword made of pillows." And with that comic and comforting image, both surrendered to yet another nap, convinced they were indeed building something grand. The guide now had a proud new section, the strategic nap, recharging energy for nothing more. And beneath this title was Pippin's phrase in bold: "It isn't laziness if you're recharging. It's strategy." A well-placed nap can be more revolutionary than 1,000 completed tasks. And so, between laughter and dreams, Merry and Pippin showed the Shire, and themselves, that sometimes, the greatest achievement is simply closing your eyes at the right moment. Chapter 5: The Silent Triumph of Chosen Rest. True peace is not found in guides or rules, but in the stillness of a moment well lived, or better yet, well rested, said Pippin, resting his head in his hands and gazing at the clouds dissolving slowly across the sky. Merry, seated beside him, did not answer at once. He simply let the silence stretch, as if he understood that some truths need no confirmation, only room to rest. After days spent on drafts, experiments, and chapters that felt more like traps for themselves than wisdom, fatigue had arrived not as an enemy, but as an old friend finally inviting them to abandon the pursuit. The guide, once crammed with ambitious titles and playful diagrams, now lay open on Merry's lap. Its pages, stained with ink, wine, and crumbs of bread, asked for nothing more. They no longer clamored for rules or discoveries. It was as though the notebook itself sighed, content to have served laughter, and now longing for rest, just like its authors. "You know, Pippin," Merry began softly, as though speaking more to himself than to his friend. "Perhaps we erred in trying to capture rest as though trapping a bird. Rest does not accept cages." Pippin rolled onto his side in the grass, his green eyes half closed with the gentle drowsiness of the afternoon. "It's like trying to teach the wind how to blow. It blows when it wants, not when we command it." Merry smiled at the simplicity of the remark. In it was more wisdom than in all the notes they had made. The two hobbits had spent much of the morning trying to revise the chapters of the guide, but each sentence seemed to dissolve before the quill reached its end. The technique of the vacant stare had turned into scribbles resembling flowers. The strategic nap contained so many contradictory notes it was no longer clear whether it was advice or a joke. Pippin, in one final effort, had tried to draw a comparison chart between laziness and strategy, but fell asleep upon the page, leaving the imprint of his cheek like an official stamp. Merry, chuckling softly, did not wake him. He simply wrote beside it, "Final result, sleep is the clearest note we can offer." When Pippin awoke, there was no scolding and no further attempt. They simply rose, stretched, and walked in silence to the lake shore. There, under the reflection of the afternoon light, they realized they had reached the only possible conclusion: the art of doing nothing cannot be taught, it must be lived. The landscape around them seemed to share the same mood. The hills rolled in gentle curves, draped in green and gold, like giant pillows laid out by the earth. Bees drifted lazily among late blossoms, and the river ran in a low murmur, carrying fallen leaves along at leisure. In the village, a few windows were open, releasing the sound of kettles and distant songs. Children played far off, but even their voices seemed softer, as though they too had learned, in some way, the language of rest. Merry drew a deep breath, letting the light air fill his lungs. "We don't need rules, Pippin. We only need to listen to the world. It already teaches us to stop." "Yes," Pippin replied, leaning against a sun-warmed stone. perhaps the guide needs only a blank page so that each may write their own rest. The notebook was not abandoned, yet it was no longer forced into being a manual. Instead of rules, Merry began to fill its pages with descriptions. Today, we fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof, the west wind carried the smell of bread, and rest came before supper. Pippin, for his part, preferred doodles, clouds, mattresses, cushions, sometimes only circles repeating until the pencil slipped from his weary hand. And there was beauty in that. The guide ceased to be a work to be completed and became a diary of lived moments. "Look at this, Merry," said Pippin, leafing through the messy pages. "Our guide is just like us, full of flaws, scribbles, and stains, yet still alive." Merry nodded, running his fingers over the uneven handwriting. "That's what makes it true." The afternoon waned, and the sun leaned toward the west, spilling gold across the hills. Sitting beneath a willow, the two hobbits let themselves drift into gentle conversation, made more of silences than of words. "You know, Pippin," Merry said at one point, "I always thought we needed to prove something to the world. That our friendship, our adventures, should become pages or songs so they might be remembered. But now I see, perhaps it doesn't need to. This moment is enough." Pippin gave a lazy smile. "The world remembers wars, Merry. But who will ever remember the afternoon when two hobbits dozed beneath a willow?" "We will," Merry replied firmly. "And that is enough." When night came, the crickets began their concert, and the moon rose slowly, like a silver guardian. Merry and Pippin, wrapped in blankets, gazed at the starry sky. There were no plans for the next day, no hurry, no obligations. Only the simple contentment of being. The guide, closed beside them, seemed to gleam under the moon's gentle light, as though satisfied with its unfinished fate. "You know, Pippin," murmured Merry, nearly asleep, "perhaps the greatest gift we can leave is not the guide, but the example. If others see us pause, see us rest, perhaps they will remember to do the same." Pippin yawned, nestling into the soft grass. "Yes, a legacy of cushions and dreams. That's better than any medal." And so, between fading laughter and deepening silence, Merry and Pippin understood that inactivity did not need to be taught. It only needed to be lived. The moon carried on its path, and the Shire sank into stillness. No written rule could explain the peace that stretched over the fields. No chapter of the guide could translate the worth of a simple, well-rested night. The guide had become a silent witness that life need not be rushed to be full, and that true rest is found, not sought. Chapter 6: The True Hobbit Art, Falling Asleep as Words Turn to Breeze. Sleep is not fleeing from reality, it is embracing a gentler one, where the mind dances free and the body finds its true rest, murmured Pippin, in a voice scarcely louder than the wind, before his eyelids surrendered to the kind weight of night. The candle flame trembled on the round table, casting soft shadows across the walls of the smile. Upon the polished wood lay the Hobbit Guide to the Art of Doing Nothing, open on a page undecided as to what it wished to be, half phrase, half silence. There were ink stains, signs of interrupted laughter, marks that told, in themselves, a sequence of little feasts. The guide was not finished, and perhaps that was its way of being complete. It was not a book of commandments, but a living portrait of two friends who, in trying to teach rest, had discovered it without effort, as if stumbling upon it while turning the corner of an ordinary day. Merry slept against the low armchair, chin lightly fallen to his chest, the quill still tucked behind his ear. Pippin, curled beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of cider, smiled as he dreamed. The clock in the hall marked the hours with slow beats, and the house itself, like a breathing being, inhaled and exhaled that silence of warm oven and distant rain. There, between firelight and shadow, the irony of the world seemed suspended, a guide to doing nothing that was never closed, and therefore perfect. For the art of pausing accepts no frame, it simply happens, and when it does, it is enough. If anyone had narrated the guide with gentleness, they would have said the greatest wisdom was not in the clever titles, nor in the diagrams and arrows that tried to capture the flight of rest. It was in what did not fit upon the lines, the lightness of two hobbits who knew how to savor the rhythm of life with simplicity. The unfinished guide was like a door left ajar, so that quietude might come and go as it pleased. It was a legacy of cushions, of willow shade, of tea forgotten on its saucer, still warm. Outside, the Shire stretched in folds of hill and dew, and the moon, which that month had learnt to be shy, leaned over the rooftops like an old aunt putting out lamps so as not to wake anyone. Beneath that silver watch, dreams arrived like silent boats. And we glimpsed them, lightly, without touching, only pointing the way for the listener. In Merry's dreams, there was a dirt path that wandered without hurry, skirting mossy fences. With each step, the night tuned the world's sounds, the rustle of leaves, the tiny step of a hedgehog, the murmur of a brook whispering words understood only by stones. Rest there did not need to be summoned, it came with the smell of bread from a distant oven, with the star that blinked as if to say, "I am here." Merry saw, among the branches, the silhouette of a willow he swore he recognized, but in dreams no place is exactly that place, everything is only what suffices. In Pippin's dreams, the glow of feasts did not tire the eyes. There were long tables, upon them fragrant herbs, steaming pies, and songs that demanded no breath. It was enough to smile, and the melody carried itself forward. Suddenly, the musicians rested their arms, and the music continued alone, as though kin to the wind. And then a dance of short, near-still steps taught the chief lesson: not every movement is advancement, sometimes it is only the heart adjusting its pillow. Here, the narrative asks leave to guide the one lying on the other side, you, through these landscapes. There is nothing to do, only to follow. Imagine the night opening a path as light as bread dust. The Shire's hills ripple like spread blankets, and it matters not whether you go or return, the road accepts both directions, and in all of them there is rest. You pass a wooden gate that does not creak, it opens out of courtesy. There is the scent of freshly picked apple, the softest murmur of water that recalls breeze through broad leaves. The sky breathes a gentle light upon the puddles, and each puddle is a mirror where a fragment of constellation combs itself for sleep. Walk a little further. Feel the grass receive the weight of your step and give it back, as if the earth recognized you. To the left, a barley field whispers stories made of equal syllables, repeated until they become peace. To the right, a row of willows lowers its arms to shade you, even though it is night, for willows in dreams know the kindness of exaggeration. At the trail's end, a brook offers stones broad as little plates. You choose one, sit, and time, which had been running with its tongue out, decides to sit too. Nothing demands your attention, nothing calls your name, nothing urges your pace. The world quiets its words, and even thoughts, weary, fold their tents. The wind tidies the hair of the grasses, the stars converse among themselves without urgency. The night, content, lays a fine wool cloak across your shoulders. And if news comes from afar, let it arrive lazily, like a letter certain it will only be opened in the morning. Let us return to the smiles table. The candle, spent, sheds one last tear of wax and is silent. The open guide shows a title Pippin had scribbled before sleep claimed him. From here on, each one invents their own pillow. Below, Merry had left a trail of ink that might be a signature, or a road toward the blank margin. The page, moved, accepts both readings. It wants nothing more. And yet, by wanting nothing, it fulfills its purpose. It reminds whoever may one day turn its pages that peace is no prize of any race. It is the natural way of ours when we cease to chase them. If you, listening, feel your eyes grow heavy like ripe fruit, accept it. There is no hidden plot to untangle before sleep. Every knot of this tale has been undone on purpose. Merry and Pippin sleep. The house sleeps. The clock does not mark lateness of any kind, it merely cradles what is coming with woolen steps. The crickets open their little string theatre, and between each note are intervals of sweet silence. It is within those intervals that the mind settles, that the body lies down within itself. Perhaps, in the distance, someone closes a window. There is the faint creak of a latch, a sigh of wood, and the hush of cloth meeting its frame. Think of these sounds as one recalls an old song, first the breath, then the word, at last more breath, until the word too goes to sleep. If a memory drifts in, a childhood street, a friend's face, the scent of coming rain, do not hold it. Let it pass, like a boat that knows the harbor and needs no lighthouse. Now the images grow gentler still. An orchard, in generous rows. The roundness of apples beneath the moon. A stone bench holding the day's warmth. The world, made of little treasures, holds you as though you belonged on its favorite shelf. And you do. There is a kind of wisdom that can never be fully written, and when one tries, it escapes like water through fingers. The Hobbit guide to the art of doing nothing remains open, not out of neglect, but in faithfulness to what it means to say, do not close the pages of rest, let them breathe. The inheritance of two friends lies less in what they wrote and more in what they accepted pausing, accepted the tenderness of limits, accepted that the best of roads is sometimes not to depart. Pippin stirs a little in sleep and, without waking, repeats the old truth, now mingled with the music of dreams, sleep is not fleeing, it is embracing. Merry perhaps answers with an invisible gesture, the hand seeking the blanket, the breath finding the rhythm of night. And that is all. Before we close, a final song, the sighs of a single eyelid lowering. Come, night, wound like thread. Roll the hours soft and slow. Where the willow bows its head. Let sleep its nest bestow. Let the world keep what is weight. Let the home keep what is kind. Let the mind, now meek, lie straight in the wide lap of the ground. And with that, no one argues further. The guide rests, the authors rest, the story itself lies down where it always wished to lie, in the ear of the listener, with the exact weight of a feather. If tomorrow someone asks whether the book is finished, the answer will be a smile and a gesture towards the willow's shade. It is finished enough to teach without words, it has gone far enough to reach here.